carrier-based dive bomber and catapults developed as early as 1932. Aerial torpedo tested around the same time. Let's see here. Goering was a pain in the ass. Ryan, reading material. Yeah, it's funny. I brought books for all these episodes, and I brought 3 for a German ship episode, which is the most out of them all. This is Admiral Erich Raeder's bio, published with the Naval Institute Press in 1960. Raeder was one of the few high-ranking... Dönitz has a bio. He survived. But unlike a lot of the other senior Nazi party members who all went down with their Fuhrer, Raeder actually survived and wrote a bio about his time and as sort of the admiral in charge of the German Navy through the beginning part of World War II. We're going to talk about, unlike our previous episodes, we're not here to talk about a battleship or even a pocket battleship.
Well, I'm not sure how much good I'm going to be then.
So we're going to talk about Graf Zeppelin today.
Okay, a cruiser that has a flight deck on it.
Yeah, but isn't that what CVs are? Just aviation cruisers?
That's true.
Okay. All right. We'll be right back. All right. Welcome to the Graf Zeppelin episode of the Portholes podcast. I'm Jack with the Naval Institute and Bering Strait. And of course, once again, joined by Ryan Szimanski here in his office aboard Battleship New Jersey. In case you hear anything weird, this is an active work site and things are going on right now, so you might hear noises throughout the video.
Maintenance department should be home for the day, but we're still going to hear the general announcements and those sorts of things.
That's fine. So, Ryan.
In many ways, Battleship New Jersey is more of an aircraft carrier than Graf Zeppelin, in that New Jersey carried up to 3 aircraft in her career.
And you had aviation facility. Yeah. Okay. So New Jersey, better aircraft carrier than Graf Zeppelin.
That's the hill I'll die on.
Okay. All right. Well, let's dive into, shall we? So, Graf Zeppelin. Let's go over some basic facts really quickly, because I think this is a ship that a lot of people don't like. They've heard the name. And especially if you're a World of Warships fan, you've heard it and seen it potentially in the game. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people don't necessarily know Graf Zeppelin and the history of the actual ship.
So many people talk about it as a fantasy ship. She was built. She was nearly complete.
It was almost done.
Right? She was a real-life ship that existed and floated during World War II. And people don't realize that this ship had a service life ish, and is real history, not one of the paper designs that people always complain about for no good reason.
Right. A lot of people forget that, they put Bismarck and Tirpitz at sort of the top, but they forget that, Nazi Germany built these 3 large capital ships right there sort of all together, and then Graf Zeppelin just sort of missed the bus, and unfortunately. So, a little bit of facts. Graf Zeppelin was laid down in December of 1936. In the same, so Gneisenau was launched, and that slip was opened up, and so they laid down Graf Zeppelin, which at the time, kind of like Yamato, which would have been whatever serial number. It wasn't named Graf Zeppelin at that point. So kind of like Bismarck and Tirpitz, which were laid down as.
I don't remember the
F and G. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. Isn't it F and G?
It would be 6 and 7. Which letters are 6 and 7?
Yeah, F and G. Yeah. There you go. See?
Look at that big brain.
We can do this. Okay.
So she would have been carrier A?
Yeah. So she would have been Flugzeugträger A. And then, of course, she had a
Gesundheit.
Yeah, she had a sister, which would be Flugzeugträger B.
You stole the words right out of my mouth.
Okay,
people attribute the name Peter Stresser to often.
Okay, so Graf Zeppelin was laid down and as aircraft carrier A1. Brilliant. There's a lot of originality there, and then was launched in December of 1938. So 2 years later. So
yeah, that's pretty common for a capital ship to have a 2-year.
Graf Zeppelin is in the 800 feet, she's like 800 and some odd feet long. So that's a big ship.
A little bit longer than Gneisenau.
Yep. Let's see here. So here's the real history of the ship. So as Graf Zeppelin is being worked up and is going under the World War II, obviously breaks out. In 1940, all work is stopped and the hull is towed from Kiel to Gdania, and some of the 6-inch battery is removed and sent to Norway. In June of 1941, because of Barbarossa, she was towed to Stettin. And then in November 1941, with sort of Barbarossa kind of progressing, she was towed back to Gdania. And it was in this period, too, at the end of 1941, of course, Pearl Harbor and everything, Germans are like, oh, maybe we kind of want that.
Carriers turned out to be a good thing.
That could be nice. And then, of course, by November of 1941, too, Bismarck has already been sunk.
Yeah.
By, of course, it's Bismarck's crippling blow is by, taking a torpedo to the rudder, which,
and the Germans don't recover their sailors or their logs, so they have precious little information about what was successful in that ship and what wasn't, but they sure know that she was crippled by torpedo aircraft from an aircraft carrier. So
then in 1942, there's a renewed interest in the German Navy acquiring aircraft carriers, but what are you going to do with it?
Yeah, at that point, what do you do with it?
So let's see here. So Hitler says, okay, finish Graf Zeppelin, but then you're also going to build, you're going to convert a few other ships into carriers as well. So the Germans have a incomplete Admiral Hipper class hull, Seydlitz, and they're going to slap a flight deck on that. Which
call her Wesser or Vesser.
Vesser, yeah, and which is for the World of Warships fans, that's your Tier 6 mainline German carrier. That's that Admiral Hipper based ship.
Another one that was nearly complete. And then...
Yeah, and they also said they have a couple like passenger liners that they're also going to basically just scrape off and convert.
And they'd seen Japan do that pretty successfully, and so
and the Italians do that with Aquila and Aquila, and so we do that.
Aquila is another one that's nearly complete, and they just stop.
Right, and this was supposed to be done by 1944. Yeah, exactly. And so yeah, but then obviously that doesn't happen. The ship is, it's just never completed on that. Obviously Germany loses, and the Graf Zeppelin is initially scuttled like in port, similar to the way Gneisenau's hull is scuttled. Eventually refloated by the Soviets, towed out into the middle of, it's off Poland, and somewhere, and then the hull is used in ordnance test and sunk, and the wreck is then discovered in 2006.
And I feel like we only recently found out that Graf Zeppelin had a Soviet career that was actually a couple of years long. It wasn't...
Yes, so in 1946, Soviet authorities took control, even though in reality that they shouldn't have done that. 1947, sunk as a target ship by Soviet forces using torpedoes, and then found by Polish divers in July of 2006.
Yeah, many of the older history books sort of just stop when she's scuttled by the Germans.
Yeah, so but obviously the Soviets though never completed Graf Zeppelin. It's not like they used Giulio Cesare. Yeah, Nerva Ross
or Royal Oak or
so they didn't. So it's not like the Soviets finished Graf Zeppelin and then used it and then scuttled it. It's they just used the hull for target practice, and then that was the end of Graf Zeppelin. So episode over.
That's the ship's whole history.
That's the ship's whole history. No, we got more to say. So Graf Zeppelin, interesting that as a country that can only with sort of limited resources to put into large capital ships. Obviously, one of the biggest issues, Hitler was pissed that, Bismarck, this huge investment lasts, a week.
Yeah.
And so in terms of Reich marks per day is pretty ridiculous.
Yeah.
But that's what always fascinated me about Graf Zeppelin. You put this huge investment into a massive ship, and then it doesn't even get sunk. You just don't finish it. It just sits there. How do you... I can understand being angry that your admirals pushed Bismarck out and attempted to do its job, and it got sunk. Okay, like, yes, that would make me angry, but...
By a fleet that's 10 times larger than yours.
Right, and that's in Rader... Of course, Rader always said that. Rader said, Hitler always failed to grasp the idea that the Royal Navy is so much larger, and we can never stand toe-to-toe with them. And the idea that you're really going to make us build all these battleships that we can't build just in general, and then attempt to sail them out and fight the Royal Navy, you're insane. Of course, you can't say that. But again, Rader lives to write a bio to be published by the Naval Institute Press in 1960, and the Fuhrer dies in his bunker in April 45.
Also, somebody had to be advocating to build those battleships in the first place, and Hitler he knew nothing about the naval stuff. He had served in the army. He could claim to know something about that. And he didn't really care for naval matters all that much. So you have to imagine that Rader is behind the scenes fighting with the other heads of the military services for funding for these projects, instead of just going with the pocket battleships, which are perfectly good and meet the German need for a commerce raider, since their navy cannot equal them. And yet, all of a sudden, they start building battleships and carriers and non-commerce raiding cruisers.
So, obviously, you mentioned, I think in the first episode that I mentioned Graf Zeppelin, where someone actually asked for this episode. So that's why we're doing this. But I mentioned the political infighting in the Nazi Party. So the idea that, and in Rader's book, he says it completely. It's there was the infighting between him and Göring on who should control airplanes.
This is going on everywhere at this time.
Yes.
Should naval aviation be part of the Navy or part of your aviation branch?
Right.
Whether it's the United States and the Army Air Corps is trying to fight for that, or Great Britain and the Royal Air Force, or Nazi Germany.
So we have evidence to say that Germany has begun developing dive bombers and various carrier-related things in the interwar period, even as early as 1932. So they're definitely thinking about it, and it's kind of hard not to when you see what Japan has been doing. And then you certainly see, like, the Lexington class carriers.
What impressive looking ships.
It's amazing.
The size of them, the firepower.
It's amazing to think, like, you have, and I said this, but Langley should not be CV-1. It should be experimental, blah, 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 go away. Lexington, CV-1. But the point is...
We're going to come back to that later because I have some thoughts on Graf Zeppelin being carrier number 1 for Germany.
So CV-1, Lexington, is this massive ship and is only really up until like the midways in terms of length. Because I think because all the other, because obviously Ranger, whatever, and then all the Yorktowns are even smaller than that, and then Essex is kind of similar.
Yeah, I'm not even sure if they match the displacement yet.
Right, but so the Lexington and Saratoga, those are big ships, and for them to be CV-1 or 2 and 3, but 1 and 2.
Yeah, the first fleet carriers.
Yeah. So obviously the Germans have to be looking around and saying, wow, that's impressive. Obviously, one of Graf Zeppelin's most interesting features is the cruiser-like secondary battery.
Very common feature in the 1920s when these ships are being built.
And so a lot of times people go, wow, that's a lot of like secondary battery for an aircraft carrier and such, and thus so that like in World of Warships, like the German carriers kind of carry that idea. So they have the secondaries just like the battleships do. But I mean, Lexington had 8-inch guns. 8 of them. Yeah. Yeah. No. And I believe Kaga had sort of the 8-inch casemates down sort of aft. But then didn't they also have like back before the World War II configurations when they had like the multiple flight decks? Right. Like I think Kaga and both Akagi too had like a 6-inch turret, like a triple 6-inch, like mounted on each side of that like center deck or something.
Yeah, I know early designs for Soryu and Hiryu featured similar turrets as well.
So the idea that, so at this point in time, we're still really bridging the gap between like cruisers and aviation.
You know,
like, so
aircraft
CV,
carriers evolve out of battle cruisers primarily. And if you look at the aircraft that are available in the 1920s, they're short-ranged, so your carriers are going to have to get very close to the enemy battle fleet to use them. And they're not that survivable as weapons platforms. They can't carry heavy ordnance, so they're not going to sink any battleships. They just can't carry bombs or torpedoes heavy enough to defeat their armor. So there is a real chance that these ships are going to be run down by enemy destroyers or cruisers and have to fight their way out.
So you end up seeing a lot of these ships with...
In the 1920s.
And then, But then, so then we're fast forward a little bit here. So now it's the end of the 1930s, and Graf Zeppelin comes out with 16 6-inch case guns in sort of like a 4x4. So 2 times 2, 2 times 2. So 16 total 6-inch guns, which end up getting removed and taken to Norway and put around sort of the Atlantic Wall and that kind of deal.
By this time period, most of your Japanese ships are losing those in favor of 5-inch guns. Your American ships the new built ones are losing them. By 1942, the 8-inch turrets are removed from Saratoga. Your British carriers are being built with their 4.5-inch guns in a very similar arrangement, but higher up in the hull, with the same 2x2x2 by...
Right, exactly. Now, so that becomes... So if you look at... and I can maybe put some footage from World of Warships in here so you can know what I'm talking about. But the casemates, they take up hangar space. Like if you look, they're not like deep in the hull, like kind of on Kaga. They're like on the deck line, which means that they're taking up places where you could potentially have, either a larger hangar space or store or something. And you got to think...
Which probably gives them more utility. Kagas, I really wonder, being that low in the ship, it's just an opening that water can get into, and then they don't have that much range or arcs of fire.
So, I think Kagas are pointless. I think we can go with that. I think if Graf Zeppelin actually had to engage, like a British destroyer or something like that, they would certainly have a better chance dealing with it than maybe Kaga would. But I guess my point is that like shell handling, and because like that's a pretty decent sized fighting compartment, because you have these guys who are trying to load these 6-inch guns.
And they're twin mounts, but they're really close together this way, so you know that they have to have a lot of room on each side to be feeding those.
Exactly. And so this is not a small compartment, and so you got to think like, and a 6-inch round is twice as heavy as a 5-inch round. So you have all this extra machinery and everything that's feeding those guns. And so you're just taking less and less room away from hangar space and other things that you could be getting at. Now,
which in a gunfight is a good thing. More guns, less hangars. Hangars are hugely volatile spaces. If those get hit even by destroyer caliber rounds, you've got the potential for massive conflagrations.
Now, I'm gonna mention, so if you want to see, for the World of Warships players, if you want to see all the different versions of what we're talking about. So in the game, Graf Zeppelin is depicted as a 1943, like completed in 1943. So the ship that you see has extra radar sets, different places. There's the original ship had like 2 105 millimeter mounts. Say it.
4.1
Oh
inch.
God. Okay. The original ship had 2 in front of in sort of the conning tower area, and then 3 behind. But they sort of fill in this little bit of flight deck, and then there's 3. So there's 3 down the front, 3 down the back. So you have 6 total 4.1, 105 dual purpose mounts.
That's a great place for arcs of fire. That's where you see the Lexingtons have their 8-inch guns. That's where the Essexes have their 5-inch guns.
I was going to say, mostly that seems to be where most carriers end up with their sort of larger guns, especially American carriers, like you said, the Essex. And then, so then the Graf Zeppelin that you see in game is that sort of 1943 version. But then there's 2 other versions that are in the game that people might actually not know that story behind. So in the game, the German Tier 6 Premium Erich Lowenhart is Graf Zeppelin's sister,
Okay.
aircraft carrier B, which was completed basically like up to the turtleback, but then like they didn't want to finish it because we couldn't even finish one.
Yeah, if you're not finishing A, what are you going to do with B?
They needed the material, so they just scrapped it in place. But
which at least was a better use of the material than keeping B around or A around nearly complete for the entire war.
Right. And so so in the game, that is depicted as Graf Zeppelin would have looked if finished like in 1938. So
so the initial design.
You don't get any, like a lot of the later war radar. You get the stubby bow because Graf Zeppelin, like a lot of the other German capital
didn't have
ships,
the clipper bow.
Was fitted with that clipper bow in the sort of the final stages of fitting out. And you can kind of see the original anti-aircraft armament, like lighter and fewer guns versus the 1943 Graf Zeppelin that you see. Then the final version, which is the mainline Tier 8, so the one that comes after the Hipper-based carrier, this would have been carrier C and D. The Germans knew right away that those casemates were dumb. They're like, this doesn't make sense. They take up way too much room. We don't want to build this ship. So the I think it's Parseval or whatever, but the ship you see the in game, that model is basically Graf Zeppelin without the casemates. So it's roughly the same design, but the Germans made a few changes to like the armor layout. The engines are different. I think it's primarily an all diesel layout at that point.
Okay, the Germans were trying to innovate with that as far as they could.
So that carrier, that's all diesel, no casemates, different armor scheme. Whereas Graf Zeppelin was, fuel oil, kind of like same rough power plant as Bismarck, but Graf Zeppelin 4 shafts versus the traditional design of the period. All those German capital ships had the 3.
So this is really interesting. Going back to the high seas fleet of World War I, your battleships always have 3 shafts. Your battle cruisers always have 4. And that's one of the major design differences between those types of ships. And so you see...
So still that battle cruiser lineage is still kind of rearing its head somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, often referred to as battle cruisers, they were designed as battleships. They had 3 propeller shafts.
Yeah.
Just
and the
on
armor
a smaller
belt.
side. And the armor belt is thicker than Bismarck's.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Bismarck, you can't argue that she wasn't a battleship.
Yeah, for sure.
And so it's really interesting to see Graf Zeppelin and the follow-on ships are very much in that battle cruiser lineage.
And you have to think, a lot of people who were designing those ships, it's not like when Germany lost World War I, everyone just quit their jobs and became farmers. I mean, sure, some people did, but naval architects were still naval architects. And when the various ruling powers in Germany overturned a few times, well, a lot of the shipbuilding companies stayed the same. So they're like, we need a ship that's almost 900 feet long that goes 35 knots and carries airplanes. Well, let's go to the battlecruiser files. Oh yeah, 4 shafts, done.
We had some stuff following up on the Derflinger class, and that makes a great basis for this. They even have that straight bow that we're starting with here. Yep,
and so exactly. So you see the sort of the evolution from there. Of course, never finished though. So oh well, what do you make of that? But yeah, so it's very interesting to see that you can see all the various different models and the changes so you get the 1938 version of Graf Zeppelin, the 1943 version of Graf Zeppelin, and then you can kind of see what the final models will look like with that. Because the H class in the Z plan was an all diesel as well. The Germans really liked this idea of, well, if we do diesel, then we can get the range that we so desperately need. And like we talked about with Yamato, we can't pull a whole wagon train of oilers behind us. And
earliest designs for Yamato were diesel.
But on top of that, all the U-boats are diesel.
Yeah.
So they even Raider talks about the idea like, well, U-boat will surface, we'll hook up some lines, we'll refill this U-boat and send it on its way.
That makes you very vulnerable to enemy aircraft, but in theory, doable.
I mean, in the same way that Iowa, New Jersey refueled destroyers, and I mean the same rough idea. I Another thing, Graf Zeppelin catapults.
I'm not... catapults are one of those more difficult things to innovate and design.
So Graf Zeppelin has and it looks like when you look at it, it looks like they took a period, like a contemporary period, like a catapult like that you would have on the back of New Jersey.
Okay.
And it's not like an index steam catapult like you're thinking like Nimitz or something.
Those are difficult to design.
So this is almost like, it looks like a catapult that would be on an American cruiser, and it's just inlaid in the deck at the very front. So it's not like we're going from midship forward and taking off. The planes are being carted to the front, strapped to this catapult, and just blown off the front of the deck.
Is it like cruiser or battleship style catapults where it's a 15-pound black powder charge shooting these things into the air?
I'm not sure, but
unfortunately, an unfinished ship we have less than perfect resources on.
Right, but I'm not sure if it was like that. But given the way that the catapults look, it looks just like what you would see on like your American battleship. That's sort of that exactly. And it's just inset into the deck, with the end of the catapult being the front of the flight deck.
Okay.
The Germans had extra of these, and it looks like they manufactured them for Graf Zeppelin, so they weren't like just.
Well, as far as she was in the design process, like she was 90% complete. They had to have had them by that point.
So they were definitely not just like borrowed off of German cruisers or battleships, and it looks like they had a few extras in stock. So to speak, because they sold a few to the Italians that were going to equip them on Aquila.
Interesting.
Of course, that ship was never finished either.
Yeah, very, very similar. And both of these ships I have a problem with, because in both instances, it's essentially like you start playing World of Warships and you immediately get a high-tier ship. There is no Langley at tier 4, 5, 6...
4.
Yeah, at tier 4, where you can practice and learn what you're doing, train up a doctrine, like practice with a cadre of how to land and take off from these aircraft carriers, develop catapults and arresting cables and hangar.
Because think about the iterations,
ordnance loading and refueling. That you just start with the biggest thing possible,
right? Because like Japan, think about all the carriers they produced, and even the variations in like Kaga and Akagi.
Yeah.
Like, think about how many refits they went under to become then the big carriers that you see in World War II.
Yeah.
And so you're absolutely right. Like, where's the doctrine? Where's the practice? Where's this? No, we just magically completed a 900-foot long aircraft carrier, and magically we're just supposed to,
So we're going to start playing World of Warships at tier 8 and see how well we perform at that level.
That's a disastrous formula. Don't do that.
They were copying what everybody else already had instead of figuring out how to get there on their own.
A couple other features that you might find interesting.
And that's why I like to count Langley as an actual aircraft carrier.
Oh, yeah?
Because without that stepping stone, Lexington, Saratoga are useless.
Fair enough. Very true. I'll give you that. 4 arresting wires.
Okay, so that's pretty comparable.
That's pretty comparable.
8 bells, 1,600 hours.
Just a little bit more character to your naval themed podcast. Armored elevators were an innovation.
I'm not sure of anybody else who was doing something like that.
No, so that's of course Graf Zeppelin having 3 elevators.
Okay, which again is pretty common of ships of that era.
How many aircraft do you think an aircraft carrier of this size would hold or would operate?
Well, I mean, at 800 feet, an American carrier would be carrying 90-plus planes. A Japanese carrier would be carrying 70-plus planes.
Anyone want to take a guess how many planes Graf Zeppelin could carry? Theoretically, because it never did. But based on...
If the German Navy had aircraft.
But based on...
To go with their nice carrier.
Design or the number that they came to. 42.
That is a huge investment of a airfield for a very small striking power.
Yeah, you lose a couple 109s and Stukas, and suddenly, who gives a crap? And speaking of 109s and Stukas, that was the the plane outfit. You had the Me-109 naval version and the Stuka naval version, which were basically just like whatever the contemporary, like, so you had, if Graf Zeppelin had been finished in like 39, it would have been like whatever 109 version,
B or C or whatever, yeah.
Just with folding wings. And then they did the same thing again later, which is whatever version would in 1942, just with folding wings.
Which naval aircraft have to be built to different standards than land aircraft. You can't just take an F-15 Eagle and put it on Gerald R. Ford. You've got to increase the strength of the landing gear. You've got to add an arresting hook. You've got to add enough structural strength that when the plane catches the arresting hook, it doesn't just pull off. And then the folding wings are critical to be able to take up as little hangar space as possible to add a larger air group.
The Stuka with the folding wing is quite the sight. And again, image will
the
pop
gull
up.
wings down and then fold it back up.
Well, actually, I think they fold back.
Ah,
yeah.
Interesting.
So they do that versus vertically. And I think the 109s do the same thing, but I have to check.
And at one point, they were also looking at Fiat design for a biplane torpedo plane, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So then in the original design, yes. So you had the 109s for the fighters. The Stukas were your traditional dive bomber. Big shock there. And then they went through a couple of design iterations for what a torpedo bomber could look like. And you're right, they had like everything from biplanes.
Which in 1939, everybody was still using biplanes on their carriers.
Swordfish, you know.
Yeah. In 1941, you still have swordfish in use.
In World of Warships, they, to fit that need for, since this is 1943, or in 44, whatever iteration you want to think that this carrier is operating in, they fill that that spot with like the Ta 152s, which is like the souped up version of the 109.
A fighter plane as a torpedo bomber?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So they just that's some wargaming fantasy. I don't think, I've never seen anything that substantiates that. I think
Germany wasn't developing a torpedo bomber at that stage, so they had nothing to start with.
I think wargaming just needed a late war German fighter to strap a torpedo to.
That's fair.
And the gimmick is that the torpedo planes are fast, which that plane was fast, but how fast would it have been with a torpedo strapped underneath of it? I don't know. We'll see. So, with that said, I think the main question here for Graf Zeppelin, because again, it doesn't really have that much of a history. In our cruiser special a couple months ago, we talked about Germany not really having a doctrine for these large capital ships. They did okay with the commerce rating, and they had the correct ships for that. You could say, okay, all the pocket battleships were good, and
Schornhorst and Gneisenau started as pocket battleships, and they're 11-inch guns.
And working as a pair, I think they did okay.
Yeah.
But then you get to Bismarck, and you're like, okay, well, just throw it out there and get sunk. Cool. That was obvious.
That was a traditional line of battleship. Way too much ship to send commerce rating. Even if she had gotten in the middle of a convoy, she was never going to sink more ships than her own investment.
Exactly. So, but with Graf Zeppelin, if the Germans had finished Graf Zeppelin, if all the Nazi infighting was, finished, and, Goering and Raeder were friends, and we got our airplanes, and we trained pilots, and, just everything magically worked out. And you put Graf Zeppelin, Bismarck, Prinz Eugen, and I don't know, let's just say Blucher doesn't sink. I mean, and you add in a few destroyers, and suddenly you have what looks like a modern, like carrier group that you would see sort of in the Pacific. If that is sent out in May 1941, what does that look like? How does Great Britain respond to that?
That's absolutely devastating. I see convoys being stopped at that point, like supplies no longer delivered, because neither Great Britain nor the United States, the Allies in general, do not have enough carriers to escort these convoys. And the Atlantic is relatively small compared to the Pacific. There is a lot less room to hide.
So what if Graf Zeppelin, obviously, let's just take Bismarck out of the equation for a second.
Yeah.
What if Graf Zeppelin comes up on a convoy? I mean, so we talked about, okay, she doesn't have like a huge air group. But if you're not having these ginormous midway style battles where you're losing whole squadrons in these attacks, and you're 109s and your Stukas are bombing cargo ships.
A Liberty ship has a 5-inch gun,
and you're strafing
some 3-inch guns.
You're strafing
20 millimeters.
Yeah, and you're strafing a destroyer.
1 or 2 bombers
and not
can
even
sink each one of these.
Yeah, not even like a late war U.S. destroyer, like the early war stuff that the AA guns are. You have a 3-inch gun, or you have this, or so we're not talking like serious, substantial. We're not talking like Laffy.
Yeah, and like our 4-stack destroyers, or even the British counterparts of that time period, do not have heavy anti-aircraft batteries either.
So even Graf Zeppelin operating alone, but again, we're still trying to think about this sort of larger carrier group. But even Graf Zeppelin by itself, with all those 6-inch guns, and then by the way, now you're being strafed and Stukaed and everything else. That's a pretty formidable thing when it comes to commerce rating. And
I'd argue more so than a Bismarck.
Yeah, and then you add in the fact that maybe Bismarck is on the opposite side, like shooting its way through the convoy too, and by the way, Prince Eugen's doing the same, and Blucher's doing this, and
if your convoy has those heavy warships that can be used as anti-aircraft platforms, but they're not now because they're fighting Bismarck or whoever, all your cruisers or your older battleships that were with that convoy are now pulled away. Your merchant ships are done. They try to scatter at 9 knots or 10 knots,
right.
and Graf Zeppelin's planes are just cycling through relatively short missions to go out, drop ordnance, come back.
Graf Zeppelin has a theoretical top speed of 35 knots.
No way.
Whether or not she would have achieved that, but I could probably say it's safe to say she could probably do at least 31.
Yeah.
Like Bismarck. Okay. But 31's a lot faster than any Liberty ship.
Yeah, no, even at 35 knots, not attainable by a ship of that size with that kind of propulsion plant they were planning. But she'd still be a 30-knot ship like other contemporary carriers. We know it's certainly doable.
Yeah.
That's utterly devastating. That shuts down the convoy system, and Russia and Great Britain are not getting supplies from the United States for whatever period of time it takes for the Royal Navy to be able to track this thing down.
So, and this is really the what if question that really sort of just grinds. So we've talked about politics and the idea that dictators need battleships. And so it's pretty clear that Bismarck and Tirpitz's completion and get them out there was prioritized. Now, obviously, there is this infighting between Raeder and Goering.
You don't have to fight Goering to get offensive capability for your battleship.
No,
that's all indigenous.
Right. And so you do have this Nazi infighting. But granted, on top of that, resources are also slowed to Graf Zeppelin for not only the other parts of the war effort, but also to finish Bismarck and Tirpitz. And I don't know. I think if you finish Graf Zeppelin is launched in December of 38.
She could have been finished in 1940 easily.
Yeah, exactly. And you could have had planes worked up and everything.
You spend 2 years in the Baltic developing tactics, training a cadre of pilots, and by 1941, Bismarck comes into the Baltic to do her training,
and so now I sort of propose this best case scenario where Bismarck and Graf Zeppelin and maybe 2 heavy cruisers. So if Bismarck kind of engages the heavy, let's say like Battleship Texas or New York is with, and we've had that conversation too, where it's like, well, now the U.S. maybe is pulled into the war because if that happened and Texas or New York engaged Bismarck, and because they were out in the same in that same bit of ocean in the same time, so it's very possible. I'm not just making that up. You could have potentially pulled the U.S. into the war a lot sooner, and then in an Atlantic focus versus at Pearl Harbor.
Roosevelt's ready to go. He's just waiting for a reason
something,
so he can convince the American public to come along with him.
And so Bismarck, let's just say, I'm thinking of tactics here for a second. Bismarck engages the heavy units and maybe attempts to pull them away, knowing that they're going to chase the battleship because that's like the clear threat. Because
first, a scout aircraft from Graf Zeppelin finds those units so that the Germans can actually plan to fight their fight and send Bismarck in where she needs to. Like, that is critical.
Right.
The number of times the German ships are operating in the same ocean as all these massive convoys and just don't find anything.
Yeah. And then, so do you think then they take the bait, they go after Bismarck, and then while they're doing that, then maybe Graf Zeppelin comes from like the other side and intercepts the convoy with maybe the 2 heavy cruisers and does that? Or
At this stage in the war, we don't have escort carriers or anything doing the scouting for these ships. So you see a
No.
German battleship. I'm in the American or the British battleship. I have to deal with that known threat.
Yeah, that's what is in front of me. That's what I have to deal with. That's what's attacking me. So
Yeah.
you might as well, and that's what I'm out here for. In reality,
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, so
Like, what is that battleship going to be able to do against an aircraft carrier
Right.
strike anyway?
so there's that. Now, that's the best case scenario. But what if we just swap Bismarck? So keep 100% of everything the same
Mm-hmm.
initially.
Mm-hmm.
Swap Bismarck for Graf Zeppelin. So someone in this party has some thought, and they say, let's finish the aircraft carrier.
Mm-hmm.
And they do everything, like you said, work up. So then Prince Eugen and Graf Zeppelin go out
Mm-hmm.
in May of 1941. If Graf Zeppelin is being tailed by Norfolk and Suffolk and the British heavy cruisers that were tailing Bismarck.
Okay.
I know they're under orders to not, like Bismarck is under orders to not initially engage, but that doesn't mean you can't send some 109s and like start pissing the British off, like that, even if you didn't directly attack, you could make them shift their focus and do something else, even if you didn't directly attack them. And then while they're kind of maneuvering, you can put distance on them. And so maybe Graf Zeppelin and Prince Eugen lose the heavy cruisers sooner than maybe Bismarck did. And
that
then,
would be critical because if Prince of Wales and Hood just show up out of the darkness, obviously Graf Zeppelin's aircraft can't do much at night. They can't target enemy ship. They can't land. So they're not going to fly off until dawn. So if the sun comes up like it does on Bismarck and Prince Eugen, and you've got two British ships within range, well, now you're in a much worse position. But yeah, if you can drive off those cruisers, change course, and Hood and Prince of Wales can't make initial contact, now you're lost in the middle of the Atlantic.
And then maybe they do break out.
Yeah, that would be a breakout.
And
at
then
that
they
point.
only figure it out sort of later on.
And then basically, you're at the center of a 100-mile radius where if you find any sort of merchant ships or convoys, with your scout aircraft, you can launch a strike and do significant damage.
And you do have, with at least that one Admiral Hipper, with Prince Eugen, you do have 8-inch guns. So you could pretty much deal with anything that wasn't a battleship. In reality.
The one thing keeping Graf Zeppelin from ever being a part of a actual carrier task force like you see in the Pacific or even the British operating is German destroyers absolutely suck.
Oh God, I know.
Even refueling from Graf Zeppelin, they wouldn't have the range to go out with her in the Atlantic. So we're always talking about this carrier and cruisers or battleships. She's not going out with destroyers.
Yeah, the German destroyer fleets do and the problem is the Germans can never, because of the losses. They never, and because of the backseat the Navy takes in the war, they never develop sort of the next generation of destroyer. I mean, they do on paper, but by the time they're ordered and laid down, like they're never built. And
even those paper ones are short range, coastal. They've got a heavy armament.
Yeah, they're nothing like the Pacific destroyers that we ultimately would end up with, and maybe don't have the balance.
They can't do any aircraft stuff. Yeah, balance in the open Atlantic Ocean and in rough weather. No, Germany never develops the plans, even much less a completed vessel that's going to make an acceptable escort for a carrier.
The German so Z-52, which was ordered and laid down. Then never completed. Shocker.
The German Navy?
That's your German Tier 10 destroyer in World of Warships. And it's a sort of like this evolutionary design of sort of all the German destroyers that you see. And so you're right. So there's no great sort of huge, like real design change that allows it to be this long range. And I think that goes back to the issues with the Z plan, because in the Z plan, you had the smaller, shorter range destroyers, and then you had the larger sort of destroyer leaders, which were basically light cruisers. Yeah. Which would be the other German Tier 10 destroyer, Elbing, which is basically a light cruiser.
She's based off of the Spey cruiser design?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's just this mixture of the two, and it's really a light cruiser, but that kind of is a destroyer. And So they chose to kind of split things into two categories versus maybe building one sort of balanced design sort of somewhere in the middle.
I mean, even in the United States, we've got our destroyer escorts for convoy operations and our full-on destroyers for escorting the fleet.
Yeah.
And they're similar firepower, more powerful torpedoes, much longer range, much better seakeeping abilities, and able to operate in the vastness of the Pacific. They could absolutely wipe the floor in the Atlantic.
Think about like, but just like the difference a powered closed mount makes.
Yeah.
You think of all those Fletchers with the enclosed 5-inch 38s that are powered and they're trained like the director can fire them all. You think about these British destroyers and these German destroyers that fought through most of the war with these open mounts that were all manual. And these guys like hoisting around shells like out in the open, and it's like, how do you hit anything
with frozen spray coming on,
right,
and like building up on your
How do you do anything? And then only later do you get the sort of enclosed mounts, and then
they're fighting in Norwegian fjords in winter.
Lord.
But even in that harsh environment with a similar technology level, Britain is able to come up with something that works. And
exactly,
Germany, for all their vaunted technology superiority and industry,
just can't.
They try to make it bigger and bigger and bigger, but they never add more capability.
And again, the Z-52. So the Z-52 design. We're talking about Graf Zeppelin, and now we're tangent to German destroyers. The Z-52. The idea is that they take the 128 millimeter, I think, flak 40, or the gun that sits on top of like the anti-aircraft flak towers in Berlin. They take that gun, which is actually an incredible weapon.
Yeah,
it's when you look at it like a 5-inch 38 in terms of physical size. Like maybe I'll if I can find pictures, I will. But a twin flak 40 mount that goes on top of those flak towers in Berlin is absolutely massive versus a twin 5-inch 38 mount. And I see therein lies the problem, because you can take that 5-inch 38 mount, wrap a turret or an enclosure around it, and stick it on a destroyer. Versus, I have this ginormous flak battery that's supposed to hurl a shell miles up into the air, and now I got to pare that down to put on this destroyer, which the destroyer itself hasn't really gotten any bigger. And that was a disaster. Like Z-39, the one with like the twin 5-inch or 6-inch guns up front.
Yeah,
those things are like down by the bow.
We talk about how the Iowa class is down by the stern. Those ships,
it's like basically the front's in the awash the entire time because of the weight of them. Like, this is disastrous. So anyway, German destroyers, not good. So Graf Zeppelin,
to the detriment of the rest of the German Navy,
exactly.
Battleships, carriers, you name it.
The whole line is messed up from start to finish. Destroyers, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, aircraft carriers, and battleships all the way. Maybe we got the submarines right.
Well, those were very effective.
Type 21.
Well,
maybe those were scary had they built them in any sort of a number and were around a little sooner.
But even if you're a defender of ships like Bismarck and say that she's the greatest thing ever, the ships that are supposed to operate around her to make a task force are not. And I have never heard anybody arguing that that 1939 German destroyers, or what are they, 1939 MOBs or whatever, are anywhere near best in the world the way they argue about Bismarck.
Right. I know. Again, that's just, we talked about Bismarck and just sort of the, is that overrated? And so Graf Zeppelin, politics maybe, is that the question? Maybe had we put our Nazi infighting and our politics aside, and we had developed an air group, and we had prioritized the carrier over the battleship, if swapped 1 for 1 with Bismarck, could Graf Zeppelin maybe have actually done its job versus Bismarck? Or if we had Bismarck and Graf Zeppelin, maybe we would have been a slightly more opposing force that, of course, they all get sunk anyway at the end of the day. Yeah. Churchill made that very clear on day one. I will hunt all of you down until you are all dead, and there is nothing you will be able to do about it. Even if that means borrowing stuff from Uncle Sam.
And it took him 4 or 5 years to do it.
But we did it.
Sure enough, before the end of the war, not even by the end of the war, before the end of the war, German surface navy has ceased to exist.
Yep, absolutely. And then, of course, we did almost the exact same thing to the Japanese.
Yeah. They were unable to sortie, essentially,
And
if
of course,
not completely eliminated.
in a little bit of irony, our submarines, do some heavy work in the Pacific. We talk about, did the Germans get submarines right? Well, when we got torpedoes right, our submarines did okay. So,
and Germany had similar torpedo issues as well.
Yeah.
They were just in the war a couple of years earlier than us and had it all sorted out by the time.
Fix it, fair enough. Yeah.
And they realized that they had issues and immediately tried to fix it, as opposed to
denying it.
I don't hear anything about torpedo problems.
You said those all failed to explode? No, okay. That can't be us. Nope, we don't make junk. Yeah, anyway. So, with that being said, Graf Zeppelin, let us know if you like that ship, if you've played it in World of Warships, if you have thoughts about it, if you like the video, go ahead and like it, leave us a comment, hit that subscribe button, please, and thank you. And again, we look through the comments for video ideas. So if you have another sort of ship that you like, just in general, or something that you saw in World of Warships, leave it down below, and it could be a video in the future. Anything else, Ryan? Are we good? All right. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks, everyone.